Mhm. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see so many of you this morning as we wait to start our program and introduce our speaker, Miss Jennie Williams from Knoxville, Tennessee, and who will be presenting today. I hope all is well with each and every one of you. My name is Dennis Lloyd, for those of you who do not, who I do not know. And we're so glad to see so many of you this morning. We're going to give uh, just a minute or two for people to come on and join us as we move into the beginning of our May Presenter program. And now, can you believe that this will be Jenny, you will be our 48th, you know, uh, presenter. So we're very excited about that. And over the past 5 years, so things have moved right along with the support of everybody here. Um, and before I introduce you, and again, I just want to say good morning to everybody. There's so many of our friends here that I don't want to shout everybody out and miss somebody. But hello to everyone. I'm going to turn our meeting over to my daughter, Jordan Lloyd, who will take us through our announcements, and then she'll turn it back over to me.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. As my dad introduced me, my name is Jordan Lloyd, and I'm here to deliver the Slave Legacy History Coalition's announcements for the month of May. First announcement is that next month, just like this month, we will have another outstanding speaker. It will be one Professor Warren Eugene Milter. He's an associate professor at George Washington University in our nation's capital. The book he will be presenting is one he's spent quite a bit of time researching. It's called Out of This Strife Will Come Freedom, and it is about the free people of color and their fight for equal rights during the Civil War era. So we're excited to hear about his scholarship around that. The book is now available for purchase. So if you go into your SLHC email, you will be able to use a code to receive 30% off of the book. So in these trying times, don't say we're not helping you out over here. You can actually get a discount. So we're excited for that. And we're excited to hear him speak. Additionally, um, Dr. Jennie Williams, she will be speaking about hopefully kinfolkology, obviously, but the Clotilda Descendants Association, in conjunction with kinfolkology, present Together We Rise, which is a collective launch of descendant-based forums. So just like we're a descendant-based forum, we are not the only one operating in the United States. And we will have an online panel featuring um, at least 5 or 6 descendant organizations throughout the United States, as well as Jamel Bowie, uh, Theviolia Glimpf, PhD, and Soledad O'Brien. So we're excited for that. If you'd like to learn more, it's going to be next Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, it's going to be an online forum, so you can register online and take part from your phone. Uh, More closer to New England, actually, tonight it's called a dinner dialogue, a different kind of dinner party. I'm actually very sad that I can't attend this. I would quite love to join our friends, our fiscal sponsor at History Cambridge, their headquarters. It is going to be inspired by a Jeffersonian dinner party format, which I'm not terribly familiar with, but sounds exciting. They do have a link where they have more information about it. And it's going to be not your typical dinner party. It will be, the hope is to elicit discussions about personal stories, feelings, and deeper understanding about sustaining a sense of place. So that sounds like a really wonderful evening. If you're hoping to get out tonight and you're in Massachusetts and Cambridge area, I think that's a great place to go. You can register for that. Um, Tomorrow, Wednesday the 20th, at the Museum of African American History in Boston, there will be a book signing with Mr. Leland Clark, who will be talking about Roxbury, the rich history of that neighborhood, which my father and I both grew up in. And again, it will be at another historic venue in Boston, the Museum of African American History, in Beacon Hill on Joy Street. And finally, let's see what else we have. Want to remind you that the SLHC progress report is always available for my development friends and nonprofit. If you'd like to learn what we've been up to since 2021, we have a lovely report that we can share with you via digital or mailed copy. And also, we are expanding our development efforts. So if you have some special insight on nonprofit development that you would like to impart with us, give us a buzz. We'd be happy to take in that information. And with that, I turn over our meeting back to my dad, Dennis Lloyd.
Thank you very much, Jordan. You did a nice job there. Thank you. Uh, Again, it's good to see everyone. It's always a pleasure to see everyone. And we're very excited this morning to have Miss Jennie Williams, PhD historian, who
Yeah,
has
I
expert.
cannot hear you. Why I can't?
Who's that speaking? Can everyone else hear me? Is that right? Okay. Okay. Um, well, I'm sorry. As I was saying, today we have Miss Jennie Williams, who is a PhD historian with expertise in American slavery and domestic traffic and of enslaved persons and digital humanities. Um, she currently she currently has a book, Oceans of Kinfolks, African American Ancestral History of the Antebellum and Coastwise Traffic uh, of enslaved persons in the New Orleans area. Um, Dr. Williams is author of several other books, and she's also the founding executive of director and director of Kinology, Kinfolkology, an open archive database of collective and collaborative community dedicated to remembering the history of enslaved people. And if you had the opportunity, obviously, to read our bio on Dr. Williams, I hope you will certainly go back and read it again after her presentation. But we're very excited this morning to have Dr. Williams here, and we're going to turn over the meeting to Dr. Williams so that she can uh, give her presentation today. Dr. Williams?
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and excited to have a sort of different speaking opportunity than I usually do. I realized I could probably present and explain kinfolkology in my sleep at this point because I've given a lot of talks on, which I'm grateful for, on kinfolkology. And my research in relation to that, but this is actually the first time I've tried, or will be the first time I'm trying to present the past 10 years of my research. And then kinfolkology is sort of an add-on at the end. Um, the way I'm going to do that is sort of a hybrid approach. So sometimes I'll be, particularly for the first two chapters, when I'm talking about those, we'll be reading some excerpts. And then later on, I'll mostly be just presenting. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Are you all seeing a page that says Oceans of Kinfolk in the title of the book?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And I should say this book is not out yet. In fact, I've trying very hard to finish it, but it's not finished yet. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about the research, which will help me get it to the finish line. Okay. So this will explain the title. I'm going to jump right in. So Anna King was born into slavery around 1850. 82 years later, in the depths of the Great Depression, she was visited at her home in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, by Bernice Bowden, a white interviewer working for the Works Progress Administration's Federal Writers Project. By then, King was an elderly woman, but her memory remained sharp. Her life had begun, she told Bowdoin, more than 900 miles away in Johnston County, North Carolina. And so as Bowdoin recorded her words, King explained how it was that she came to live in Arkansas. She explained that while she was still a small child, she had been torn apart from her family, her mothers and her siblings, when her young missus, who was the daughter of the people who claimed King as property, her enslavers, married and received Anna as a wedding gift. Then the newlyweds had left North Carolina for the southwestern frontier, and they forced Anna to go with them, only to sell her once they arrived. When she reached this point of her story, Anna King paused to answer a question that her interviewer had actually not asked. She said, "Wish I was able to get back to the old country and find some of my kinfolks. If there ain't none of the old heads living, the young folks is. I got oceans of kinfolks in Sampson County." So Anna King was actually one of over 1 million enslaved people who were forcibly relocated, either with relocating enslavers or as part of the domestic slave trade, from the upper South to the lower South in about the 40 years before the Civil War. We know this was an exodus of massive proportions, and one its survivors spoke and wrote into the historical record for a full century afterwards. But that record, the one rendered up by survivors of the domestic slave trade, has no official counterpart. There's no comprehensive register or final tally, and certainly no database of 1 million names. And the reason for this is very simple. It's that forcing enslaved people to march the length of a nation required little paperwork. In fact, it required none at all. So now their steps are untraceable. It is as if they had walked in sand, unless, that is, they went by sea. In 1807, the United States outlawed the transatlantic slave trade. This legislation had another implication. Included in the same law was a statute that required captains of vessels sailing along domestic ports, so the eastern seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico, to file manifests listing the names and physical descriptions of any enslaved people they had on their vessels. The purpose of this law was to prevent, in theory, the introduction of additional enslaved people from Africa after the ban. And so with each list of names, every manifest has a sort of affidavit signed by the captain and the enslavers. And the affidavit swears that the people had not been, quote, imported from Africa after 1808. So in retrospect, this act was part of the federal government's broader effort to regulate slavery at a moment when the growth of the enslaved population and the specter of insurrection, like in Haiti, deeply unsettled slaveholders. But its most enduring consequence lies in the documentation of the identities of those carried from port to port. It produced, in other words, a systematic paper trail of America's maritime domestic slave trade, which is also known as the Coastwise trade. And here you can see one of an example of these manifests. So tens of thousands of documents like this one, bearing the names of enslaved people aboard Coastwise vessels, survive to the present. And they document the trafficking of enslaved people to and from close to 100 ports in the United States, including many in the north, including Boston, by the way. By far, though, most enslaved people trafficked in this trade, the Coastwise trade, were conducted from Virginia and Maryland, the Chesapeake, to New Orleans. And the reason for that, of course, is that New Orleans was the largest market for buying and selling enslaved people. And this is a visualization the economist made based on my research, and the size of the circles corresponds to the size of the population trafficked from each port. So this large circle represents Norfolk, Virginia, where about 18,000 people embarked who were trafficked to New Orleans. Here's Baltimore, 12,350, et cetera. So it's difficult to overstate the significance of the fact that the Coastwise trade was systematically documented in a way that survives to the present. For the past several decades, as many of you all know, historical scholarship on slavery has fixated, and rightly so in some ways, and almost obsessively, on naming and mourning the silences of slavery's archive. In doing so, historians have, in a sense, caught up to what descendants of enslaved ancestors have known for generations, which is that because of the ways in which enslavers recorded, or more often did not record, enslaved people's lives, it is very, very difficult to find records and information about individual people who were enslaved. And of course, this is archival violence that began with the transatlantic slave trade. The merchants, captains, and investors who organized that trade did not record the African names of the captives they forced aboard their ships. You can see an example of the records from the transatlantic slave trade here. This is the schooner Dolphin. And you can see it refers to people simply in quantities. So 2 slaves, 1 man, other girl, 3 slaves, 2 women, 1 girl, and they're identified only by the person who would be their enslaver when they arrived. In records like this one, human beings appear not as persons, but as quantities, undifferentiated cargo distributed among purchasers. And this documentary silence and violence is, of course, not accidental. It reflects the logic of the trade itself, in which African identities were not merely unrecorded, they were rendered irrelevant to the commercial transaction. The consequence of this violence is staggering. An estimated 12.5 million people were embarked from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade. And with very few exceptions, their original names were neither preserved in writing nor carried forward in the archive. Their names, in other words, were stolen, and they remain stolen today. They are simply beyond recovery. This epistemological violence continued after the Middle Passage on the plantations in the Americas. It persisted in equally insidious forms. The archive of slavery is, again, overwhelmingly produced by enslavers, merchants, courts, and state officials, and they recorded enslaved people primarily as property. You can see an example of this is a very typical record from a plantation in the United States. This one is from a sugar plantation. Forgive me, this was a cotton plantation in Louisiana, and the names are here, and note there are no last names, and then the numbers are just how much cotton each person picked per day. So what was preserved was not enslaved people's knowledge of themselves, but the knowledge enslavers required of them to maintain control. As a result, very few aspects of plantation life were systematically documented in ways that centered enslaved people's experience or identity. Births, marriages, kinship bonds, acts of resistance, spiritual worlds, interior lives. These survive, if at all, in fragments and in silences. But again, the singular exception in this vast and limited archive is the Coastwise trade. Yet for approximately 200 years after these records, these manifests were created, they remained largely unexamined. Even now, only 1 book-length study of the Coastwise traffic has been published, and that's Jeffrey Kerr Ritchie's Rebellious Passage. But as you can see here, that book actually focused on 1 voyage in the Coastwise trade, and according to my research, there were over 3,000 voyages to New Orleans alone. So why is this? Why has nobody taken on the task of examining the Coastwise trade in its entirety? In part, I think the relative historiographical neglect of the Coastwise trade is probably due, ironically enough, to the overwhelming scale of its archive. Surviving manifests like these number in the tens of thousands, and each one, as you can see, is extremely dense with information. They do more than list names, these records. They record ages and physical descriptions, the names of vessels and captains, and 3 different categories of enslavers, owners, shippers, consignors, ports of embarkation and arrival. They map commercial networks, and there are an infinite number of extraneous notations that include other information as well. And so while these manifests number in the tens of thousands and illuminate the names of thousands of enslaved people, not to mention thousands of enslavers and traders, the Coastwise Trade's archive is so big that I think it has deterred scholars from wanting to examine it in the past. And the reason for that is, again, to read it in full is to confront an ocean of data that resists easy synthesis and demands careful reconstruction. Aside from that, I think another factor has been the relative inaccessibility of these records. So they were originally filed with customs officials at each port of embarkation and departure, but they were consolidated at the National Archives in Fort Worth. Sometime I narrowed it down to between 1969 and the mid-'80s. But even when they were all in one location, that didn't really mean they were accessible. Because there's so many manifests, you couldn't just visit the archive in order to look at all of them. You would have to like move to Fort Worth, and who has the resources to pick up their life and move to Fort Worth? Also, well, I won't say that, who would want to? I personally have been to this archive. It's way too hot. And so geographic consolidation merely shifted the archive's barriers. It didn't remove them. Thankfully, in 2015, images of these documents filed, at least the manifest filed at New Orleans, became available for the first time. However, they became available in one of those databases that you have to have a university affiliation to access. In this case, it was Gale's Slavery and Anti-Slavery database. In part, this marked a significant shift in the accessibility of these records, but again, access remained sharply circumscribed. You could only access them if you were affiliated with the university. And otherwise, they sat behind a pretty much insurmountable paywall. And so descendant communities, independent scholars, members of the public remained largely excluded from being able to access them. So digitization did not really translate to accessibility. Incidentally, 2015 also marked the beginning of my doctoral studies at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And within my first 2 months there, in searching for a dissertation topic, actually at the time a first-year paper topic, I encountered these records. And their significance, their historic significance, historiographic, public, and above all, their genealogical significance was immediately clear. And so I began manually transcribing each document. And if you can believe this, at first I tried to do that by hand, like writing them out in a journal. That very quickly became obvious that was not going to be a working method. So I worked line by line, and this is work I continued for 5 years until I transcribed each and every manifest documenting the Coastwise trade to New Orleans, approximately 10,000 documents in total. So when I finished, I had a massive spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, and that I hope will give you a little bit of insight as to how little I knew what I was doing, is that I used Excel for this. It was a spreadsheet of about 63,000 names, and I'm forgetting something like 140 variables per name. But a spreadsheet is not a database. And so I took a position with the Slave Voyages Project, which I imagine many of you are familiar with, and they published the first edition of the database I named Oceans of Kinfolk, after Anna King's words. They published the first edition in December of 2021. Very long story short, which I've written about in other places if you're curious, but I decided the data did not belong as slave voyages. And the biggest reason for that is I believed and still believe that descendants of enslaved ancestors should have legal sovereignty over data representing enslaved ancestors. And so I founded a project, Kinfolkology, that would make that the reality. So Kinfolkology is descendant-led through our board of directors, and they steward the data. And so Oceans of Kinfolk, the second edition, is at kinfolkology.org today. However, if you visit it, you will see that I think right now I'm up to 23,000. That's because I'm manually reviewing every single entry of the original edition of the database, the 63,000, mostly because I was not as good at the transcriptions back then as I am now. So I'm redoing it all. So at its core, Oceans of Kinfolk, the database, is a database of people, 63,503 men, women, and children. And so in part, this book is an effort to tell as many of their stories as possible. However, when it comes to researching the history of slavery, finders must not be keepers. In other words, this book is not intended to be the custodian of enslaved ancestors' stories. That role belongs instead to descendants, living families and communities with loved ones named and unnamed and present in a different way in the Oceans of Kinfolk database. For this reason, whenever doing so has been possible, I have sought out the blessings of the descendants of individuals whose lives appear in these pages to write about their ancestors. That those blessings have been granted without exception has given this work its greatest meaning and also its greatest responsibility. But this book needs to be more than a compilation of individual narratives. To me, that's part of doing this history justice. And so the book has two additional objectives as well. The first is quite simply to reckon with the history of the Coastwise trade as a previously neglected part of American history. And to be clear, the legacies of America's Coastwise trade are many. Primary among them is that of the systematic violence done to enslaved families, especially within the context of the trade to New Orleans, in which research showed 87% of the enslaved people trafficked to New Orleans in the Coastwise trade were permanently and completely separated from every member of their family. So, of course, after the Civil War, countless free people posted advertisements seeking information about loved ones taken from in the Coastwise trade. You can see an example of those ads here. And now, more than a century and a half after the advent of freedom, these searches for kin and kindred continue. So the violence slaveholders and slave traders inflicted on enslaved families through the Coastwise traffic is a crime with which we have yet to fully reckon. And by the way, the economic legacies of the Coastwise trade demand an accounting of their own. The interregional maritime domestic slave trade, or the Coastwise trade, was the market of choice for many, if not most, of the major traders in American history. These were men who alchemized the commodification and forced relocation of enslaved people into sizable fortunes. The blood money of the Coastwise trade poured into several universities, Georgetown, Johns Hopkins, among them, multiple state governments, and the coffers of countless private enslavers whose descendants continue to enjoy the benefits of the kind of multi-generational wealth that has seeds planted as deep as the floor of the Atlantic. But make no mistake, there was little about the Coastwise trade in the larger context of American slavery that was exceptional. It was not uniquely cruel. It didn't engineer new degrees of violence. It did not inaugurate family separation. All of these things were part of slavery generally. And again, so what distinguished the Coastwise trade is merely its paper trail. But surely that fact only adds to the ethical imperative issued by tens of thousands of surviving manifests to narrate this history with people at its center, to tell their stories and say their names. And so what comes into view when we fix our gaze this way? Above all, what we see is enslaved people's determination to be more than isolated individuals. We see an unceasing struggle to live in relation, to create, practice, and defend and claim kinship in a world intentionally designed to fracture and negate it. We see marriages across plantations, children named for grandparents and great-grandparents and aunts and uncles, siblings searching for one another across state lines, mothers insisting upon bonds that bills of sale attempted to nullify. But we see, too, the scale of the opposition they faced. This was the violence of slavery. And so their lives reveal an unrelenting battle, physical, psychological, epistemological, and emotional, with enslavers and all of their allies, committed to slavery's central alchemy, which was the conversion of kin to commodity. And so if we look closely at the individuals, we witness both processes at once: enslavers' relentless efforts to commodify and enslaved people's equally relentless insistence on belonging to one another. And so overall, the chapters of this book try to situate the antebellum coastwise trade within the larger history of African American kinship. So rather than treating the trade as an isolated economic phenomenon, the book embeds this history in a multi-generational story about the making, unmaking, and remaking of Black families in the United States. And so I'm briefly going to go over each chapter and give you sort of themes from each. So, okay, born in Atlanta in the 1850s, Ish Webb moved to Arkansas after the Civil War, and he found work working on a steamboat. Webb was interviewed in the 30s, and he remembered his time on the water and the people he met there well. And he spoke most clearly about one person in particular. It was the captain, the white captain of his ship. He said, "We had a captain on that steamboat that never called any man by his name." This, Webb explained, had not sat right with him. In fact, the disrespect of it all irked him a lot, so much so that one day he decided to voice his displeasure. "I thought I'd tell him something," Webb told his interviewer. "The men advised me not to, for the captain was a rough man, and he carried a gun in his pocket and a gun in his shirt." But Webb had made up his mind. "I walked up to him and said, 'Captain, I don't know what your name is, but I know you're a white man. I'm a N-word, but I got a name just like you have. And from that point on, Webb said, he quit calling us out our names. So if Ish Webb ever saw the transcript of his interview, which he gave the Works Progress Administration in the 30s, I think it's safe to assume that he would have felt a particular way about the name on that document, his name. Clearly, that name had significance to him. We don't know the story of that name, but it mattered. But let's consider for a minute how Ish Webb's ancestors, the first African ancestors to arrive in North America, might have felt about their names, or at least the names that would have appeared on enslavers' documents. In all probability, they would not have felt the same way about those names, which most likely had been forced upon them by enslavers. So how did we get from one place to another? How did it come to be that Ish Webb placed so much meaning in his name when we can imagine that the first enslaved ancestors in North America would have felt a variety of emotions about their names, most likely including resentment and anger? So this first chapter argues that the meaning of enslaved people's names, as well as the names themselves, changed over time as a direct result of enslaved people's agency, their efforts to redefine names as signifiers and testimonies of kinship and relational identity. So why does this matter? Why is this part of this book? Well, Oceans of Kinfolk, the database, is the single largest repository of enslaved African Americans' ancestors' names in the world. And so in part, this is an effort to explain how I think that we should think about those names. But also we'll see that the struggle over those names, which again has such a relationship to kinship, mirrors the larger struggle over kinship itself. So how did I figure that out about names? Well, over the past 10 years, I've built a total of 5 databases, which contain the names of approximately 85,000 enslaved people. And basically, these databases have allowed me to figure out how names varied in a number of ways. The first is they varied geographically. The first is they varied over time. So here you have, and I typed them up to make it easier, a list of enslaved people who were enslaved by Daniel Hart Custis in Virginia in 1736. And I'm looking at these names, which, by the way, I figured out are roughly representative by comparing them to thousands of other names from the Chesapeake in the colonial period. You see a few themes. First is that most of the names were English, 80%, and this is 1736, so pretty early. Now, why were most of the names English? Well, because enslavers made them that way. So this was an effort of natal alienation, in which enslavers forced people to adopt new names in order to facilitate the process of negating their previous identities. But not all of the names are just like straightforward English names like James or Henry. Some of them are different. There's Pompey, Caesar, Squire, Samson, Chunk, Queen. So these names I refer to as ironic names. And they accounted for about 7% of the names of enslaved people in the colonial Chesapeake broadly. So what are these names? So what explains them? Basically, these types of names, ironic names, allowed enslavers to do a number of things. First, they made enslaved people walking advertisements for the enslavers' learnedness. Because remember, in the 18th century, enslavers, the gentry class, all thought they needed to know the classics. And so by giving enslaved people names like from classical literature, they were demonstrating that they knew all of that. But they also used these names to project, often through irony, specific traits onto enslaved people. So by naming an enslaved person king, you are mocking him for the supposed powerlessness of enslavement. Or by naming an enslaved woman Venus, you're projecting onto her the sexual availability and viability that enslaved women generally suffered. But make no mistake, enslaved people knew what enslavers were doing with these names. And you see that a number of ways. One of which is ads like this one for fugitives from slavery, in which the enslaver says what their official name is, meaning the name they've forced upon them, but then acknowledges that the person might actually call themselves something else. So here, Venus, a woman, sometimes called Winnie. Or here, an enslaved man named Jupiter, who may call himself his African name. Okay, but how do names change over time? So this is a list of people sold in 1860 by the Corbins of Virginia. And it is, again, roughly representative of the antebellum period, so 19th century Chesapeake. So how names changed? Well, first, those ironic names almost disappear. They go to 2%. Why is this? In part, it's because enslavers, over time, enslaved people more often name their children than enslavers. And you can see that they generally did not choose the ridiculous names enslavers chose. So here you have a man named Royal, whose children all have different sorts of names. Brutus, whose child is Beck. But again, as those ads demonstrate, enslaved people didn't wait for new generations in many cases. Here we have Hercules, who called himself Stephen. English names become more common, but that does not mean that enslaved people just unthinkingly adopted white names. And you can see that in a number of ways. One of which is that what may have been slave names to start inevitably became kin names. So this is an enslaved man named Spotswood's Griffin who was sold in that 1860 sale. He was born around 1805. In all probability, that name was forced upon him because there was a famous enslaver named Alexander Spotswood, one of the first governors of Virginia. But when his son was named Spotswood Jr., it would most likely be named after his father. We also see names that people chose as testimony. So one of my favorite examples of this is comparing the names Paul and Moses in Oceans of Kinfolk. In 63,000, so enslaved people would have known who Paul was because enslavers love to quote Ephesians, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear. But in a database of 63,000 names, there are 34 Pauls and 422 Moseses. I'm gonna have to speed up here. Okay. Also, enslaved people acquired surnames over time. This, though, is often misunderstood. Enslaved people acquired surnames to signal association with kin, not their enslavers. But there's another difference here, and this is key. The explanation of this difference is key to the whole book. So these are two manifests from the same period, but they look very different, right? Here we have last names. Here we have no last names, and also names like Venus and King George, but they're both from 1836. What explains this is that this record is from South Carolina, and enslaved people's names in the lower South differed in a lot of ways, most of which has to do with the fact that the population there was more recent to North America, whereas the enslaved population of the Chesapeake had been there 4, 5, 6 generations by the 1800s. And so overall, what this analysis of names shows you is that names were a battlefield in which enslaved people fought over names because of their association with kinship. And that is the theme for the entire book, the struggle over kinship. So quickly, the chapter 2, most of the population trafficked in the Coastwise trade came from the Chesapeake. And so this chapter shows that population, and I use the enslaved population of the Carrolls as an example here, that population had extremely deep roots by 1800. So in order to understand the violence of the domestic slave trade, you have to understand that the people sold, who here are represented by the red squares, came from very deeply rooted communities and families. Let me skip ahead here. Wow. Okay. So chapter 3 looks at the population trafficked from the Low Country. And as I said a minute ago, that population had a different ancestral history. Very briefly, they had a greater proximity, both culturally and temporally, to African ancestors. And so for this population, the Coastwise trade would have had very painful resonance with the recent Middle Passage. And you can see that in a quote here by an enslaved woman who was trafficked from Charleston. And when she's interviewed in the 1930s, this is how she described the experience of the Coastwise trade. She said, "Yes, I remember the water. They made us go by sea because then we can't go back. God help us." And I don't think it's a coincidence that this woman was from Charleston, where the memory of the Middle Passage would have been so recent, and the association there of water and permanence. Okay, chapter 4, there's a lot of details about the voyage that I won't have time to go into. So I want to highlight 2 things about the voyage. The first is that I think historians have had an assumption that the domestic slave trade was less barbaric in some way than the Middle Passage. And it's true that the mortality rate was lower, but what I found is the reason for that is simply that the voyages were shorter. Crowding in the coastwise trade was often the same as it was in the Middle Passage, where enslaved people had less than an amount of space you'd have in a coffin per person. And so you see that when the crowding is really bad, you see that reflected in the records like this one, where this person is marked as having died at sea. The other thing is just to point out that these voyages were carceral spaces. They were extensions of plantations, extensions of the system of slavery broadly. Here you can see evidence of that. And this man, Ned, is marked as being, quote, in double irons for bad behavior. Chapter 5 is based on research I've done into the sales of enslaved people using notarial records of those sales. So I've examined approximately 2,000 of them at this point. And the largest findings from this chapter that I want to share with you, that's what the records look like, are two. The first is that traders accounted for just 1 in 10 of the sellers in New Orleans, but over half of the people who were sold. So what that means is that New Orleans was, most of the people sold in New Orleans had been trafficked there. So it just gives you a scale of the human trafficking in the antebellum period. The second finding is what I mentioned earlier, which is that in total, 87% of the people trafficked in this trade were ultimately separated from their whole families. And I got that by comparing the data of Oceans of Kinfolk and this database, Louisiana Kindred. That's a visualization of that. Chapter 6 is a case study of what historians call planter migrations. So planter migrations are when enslavers moved and made enslaved people go with them. And there has been, in my view, a wrongful assumption that this was less violent to enslaved families. This case study suggests that was not the case at all. So 3 enslavers trafficked about 116 people from Virginia, Mobile, and Maryland to a plantation in Louisiana in 1828. Within 10 years, over half had died of life on sugar plantations and also cholera. And then ultimately the plantation failed in 1837 and everybody else was sold. This is a record of that sale. So this really, I don't think this is exceptional, challenges that myth about planter migrations. Okay, I'm going to end with this, this chapter. So, which talks about life in Louisiana among people who were sold there. And I'm going to focus on one case study. So in I'm forgetting what year, 1836, an enslaved man named Isaac was gifted from mother to son, a white mother and white to white son in Maryland. You can see the record of that here. We don't have another record of him for a few years until he escaped slavery in 1842. He was in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, and he fled to Baltimore, which most times when enslaved people ran away in Maryland, that's where they went, because you could hide out, pretend to be free, but not abandon your family forever. So this is the fugitive advertisement for Isaac. But he was caught, taken to the city jail, and then the worst case scenario happened, which is this trader, Hope Slatter, purchased him from the jail. That's what this means, took custody of him. Hope Slatter trafficked, I'm forgetting my own research, something like 3,000 people to New Orleans, and Isaac was one of them. Here you have him on the manifest. Isaac Phillips, 22 years old, 6 feet tall. So ultimately, Isaac Phillips ends up being sold to an enslaver named Alsip Dean, a Prussian recent immigrant. And Alsip Dean wanted to be a sugar planter, but he was broke. And so instead, he had a shack. His shack was right here on Joe's Bayou. This is Carroll Parish, Louisiana. I've been to Carroll Parish. There's still nothing there but cotton. It's a really desolate place. Isaac Phillips later described Alsip Dean's shack as existing on an island, which was probably because this waterway around him. But you could imagine the isolation. And there was only one other enslaved person there. So, and Alsip Dean, by all accounts, was sadistic. I'll spare you the details, but tortured Isaac and the other man. But eventually, Alsip Dean decided that he didn't want the other enslaved person anymore, and he had purchased him from a neighbor named James Brown. So he told James Brown, I don't want this person anymore. Give me a refund. And James Brown, the neighbor, refused. And so they get in a feud. And that's when James Brown approaches Isaac and the other man, whose name was Lewis, by the way. And James Brown says, let's solve all our problems. You should kill Al-Sabdeen. And if you do it and give me his money, I'll help you escape. So Isaac and Lewis deliberate for a week, 2 weeks, and then they decide to do it. So they sneak into James Brown's shack, smother him with a pillow, and then they escape with James Hall posing as his enslaved people. They're caught, taken to the Carroll Parish jail, but then they escape jail. Here's an ad for them after they escaped. Now, Lewis, the other enslaved man, is a mystery. I have theories, but I'm not sure. Isaac Phillips, James Hall shot and killed by a bounty hunter, which is actually just fine because he was a sadistic person as well. Isaac Phillips managed to make it all the way back to Maryland, where he lived for at least 2 years under an alias as a free black man. He was eventually recognized and extradited back to Louisiana and most likely executed. But I used the story to illustrate how hard people fought, in some cases, to return home, but also just the pain of missing home in Louisiana. In the last chapter, which I will have to talk more about another time, is how the Coastwise trade links generations through time. So linking people who survived the Coastwise trade to ancestors who survived the Middle Passage. And then today, the Coastwise trade, these records are what so many descendants use to connect their ancestors in the Antebellum period. So I'll stop there.
Wow, that was absolutely powerful. Thank you so much for your scholarship, Jenny. I think we can all agree that that was very meaningful stuff, and we're grateful for the work you've been doing and excited for your book when you finally complete it.
Thanks.
We'll
Me
have you
too.
back again. I could have listened to that for another hour. We are now open for questions, so if anyone has questions, now is the time. I do see one here. Yes, okay, great. And Jenny answered it. For those of you who haven't been followed in the chat, is the Mr. Franklin referenced in the ad? Isaac Franklin, yes, Jenny says it was.
And I have the manifest for her voyage and her brothers on Kinfolkology's website on the Ancestor Profiles page. Her name, Celia Rhodes, and also Celia Gaines. I can't remember what she's listed as, but you can find it there.
Okay. Sarah, I see your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you very, very much. I've just returned from New Orleans, so this is of special interest to me. I'm president of the Lincoln Historical Society in Massachusetts. I'm very curious about what led up to the Act of 1807 and why did I always start with follow the money. Why did those engaged in transatlantic trade allow that passage to happen? Had they developed an internal market that was able
Yeah.
to supplant
Yeah.
the Atlantic market?
Yeah. So to be sure, there was contention. So South Carolina, enslavers in South Carolina really didn't want to see this passage. But overall, you have to remember that enslavers in the Chesapeake okay, so unlike in the Caribbean and South America, the enslaved population in North America grew through natural reproduction quite early, in the Chesapeake by about 1720. And the reason for that is not that slavery was more humane here. It's simply that sugar could only be grown in Louisiana. And sugar plantations, whereas other plantations were work camps, sugar plantations were death camps. And sugar was the primary cash crop of the Caribbean and South America. And so there, enslavers literally worked people to death and then relied on the transatlantic slave trade to replenish them. In the Chesapeake, and even in North America generally, since there were other cash crops, the enslaved population was able to grow through natural reproduction. And so the enslavers as a whole didn't, not that they needed slavery in the first place, but in their view, didn't need the transatlantic slave trade anymore. In fact, you have to remember the Haitian Revolution is around this time. And so enslavers were actually they had two interests. One was continuing slavery and continuing to exploit enslaved people. The other was preventing insurrection like they saw in Haiti. And so it was a combination of factors, but really it was not in enslavers' interest to continue the trade.
But the people engaged in the shipping into the
Yeah.
shipping industry,
Uh-huh.
where, why because massive amounts of wealth was built, certainly here in New England,
Oh,
based
I see your question.
right.
Yeah.
So
So
that's the gist of my question is, where were they? Why did they allow this to happen?
um
They-
well, just because they weren't continuing uh to profit from slavery in that way didn't end the profiting. So for example, people in New England, white people who grew wheat could sell that wheat to plantations in the Caribbean. Also, salted codfish was a huge industry, feeding plantation people on plantations in the Caribbean. Um, Also, of course, New England eventually processes a lot of the raw cotton produced by enslaved people in the South. Um, so the profits didn't end, the method did, and the method changed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Robert, you've got a question. I see your hand raised.
Yeah.
Oh, you're muted still.
I just wanted to say, Jenny, thank you for your presentation. It's thorough. It shows a great deal of work that you've been doing. And I've run across many of the things you're talking about in my own research. And particularly one of the things you talk about is names. I won't go into great detail, but what I also did find here in New England were a number of ads for those who self-emancipated that had both the names that the slave owner called them and the names they called themselves. And so, and I've talked a bit about that and how naming was a contested territory, as you said. And, and it's interesting that in those ads, the slave owner not only knew the alternate name, but put it in there.
Yeah.
So it's clearly something very, powerful going on about identity there. Thanks.
Yeah. And that makes me want to highlight. So many of you are probably familiar with the Freedom on the Move project, which is the largest database of those ads of fugitives, ads for fugitives from slavery. Coincidentally, I just built them a new website, which launched yesterday. But those ads in general, you're right, are such an important part of slavery's archive because even though they were written by enslavers, or some cases jailers, they are one of the sources that enslaved people forced into existence. And so even the things that enslavers are articulating in those ads basically are things enslaved people are forcing them to admit that they go by another name, that they have family, that they don't want to be enslaved. And so fugitive ads are really important in that way.
Yes, and,
Um,
and with names, there's also quite a number of names in lists that I've compiled that show definite African roots, particularly Khan roots from Ghana. So that's another thing about naming is looking at what are the names, where are they coming from, and so forth. So.
I'll respond to a few things in the chat. First, I want to say that phrase grew through natural reproduction is it's in all of the literature on this topic. That actually I have a section in my book where I talk about how we should not use that phrase. And I use a different phrase called root work, which is I use to refer to enslaved people's efforts to build kin and community. Um, but I apologize for using that phrase. I'm not a big fan of it. But what I mean by it, so my sort of hesitate. So there's a question about whether I'm referring to quote breeding with that. That topic is somewhat irksome to me because I think we need to think about the entire venture. That's what the entire venture of slavery from enslavers' perspective was that. That's the battle over kinship. Enslavers trying to make the bond between a mother and child instead the bond between a commodity and another commodity, a commodity that produces another one. So from enslavers' perspective, all of slavery was quote breeding. That's not to diminish the fact that there were plantations where that was like the more of the sole focus. But so I'm referring to both by natural reproduction, though I'm actually referring to just the fact that enslaved people had families. That's what I mean.
Mhm.
But yes, including, but I'm seeing the question about rape. Yes, that's always part of this history as well. Who in this enormous field might doubt my interpretations? Well, I mean, y'all know this. There's a long history and continuation of mostly white people who dispute how systematic the violence was to African American, well, in general, but also to families in particular. And so my estimate of family separations is worse. The result is worse than all the other previous estimates in terms of the severity of the finding. But this is the first, and so I guess some historians will be like, no, not that many family separations happened. The I don't really pay much time thinking about that, but I think the reason to explain why my estimate was so much greater in terms of how many people suffered family separations. All the previous estimates have been based on um, almost all have been based on interviews enslaved people gave in the 30s. And I understand why those were the sources available. The problem with that is that if they were alive in the 30s, they were probably children in slavery and children when slavery ended. And so by virtue of not spending their whole lives in slavery, they experienced fewer family separations than they would have if slavery had continued. And so those estimates, I think, underestimate the violence. And so my estimate is the first one based on um, family separations as they occurred. So I looked at how many people were on board vessels without, so how many people were sold to traders without any kin. Then how many people were trafficked by those traders without any kin. That's based on the manifest. Then how many people who arrived in New Orleans with kin were ultimately sold with kin. And so by combining all of those calculations is how I emerged in my estimate. So it's tracking family separations as they occurred, as opposed to basing them on retrospective accounts. Should I keep responding to the chat questions? Is that
Yeah,
or
no, we've got, why don't we go back and forth? Sonia's got her
okay?
hand up, and then we've got two more in the chat that
Okay.
we can talk.
Thank you. I am Sonia Hunt Gray, and it was a brilliant presentation. Can't wait till your book comes out. Hello to Julia and to the Lloyd family, and I'm looking forward to future work with you guys. I said initially I am from Arkansas and from Pine Bluff, less than 100 miles. So what's interesting that I just wanted to share with the group, naming is very important. And I'm looking at my family. I have been looking at my family, which my grandmother was born in 1911. And so her parents had to be born at least 20 years prior to that. And so I've been looking and studying how close to the enslavement they were and what we're seeing here. And just with naming, I just wanted to share that with my grandmother, her name is Circe. So Circe comes from, the Greek gods and that sort of thing. So that'll be an interesting follow-up. Her husband was named Governor.
Mhm.
So that's, I think, from our interpretation, that is in the Black community, it was an opportunity for folks to say, hey, you
Yeah.
know, right, you're going to have to call him
Right.
governor,
Like
not
naming a girl lady.
right, right. So giving that quote unquote agency and that sort of thing. And then I grew up with quote unquote leaders in the community and back to that name Queen, right?
Mhm.
And but during the 1970s, when we grew up, we her name was Mama Queen.
Right.
So not only was it Queen, maybe a part of what you are sharing with the naming, but inside of the community, there was a giving her even more. I mean,
Right.
not even more, if it was what you're talking about in terms of Queen, and from your research, we then in turn called her Mama Queen, which
Right.
added that internal um, uh, honor to her
Yeah.
name. So I'm just giving real life examples,
Yeah.
and then that Arkansas connection, and uh, more research to be done, because a lot of folks had those types of names. And if you go back to Africa, you have folks who have beautiful names like Blessing. Their first name is Blessing. Their first
Mhm.
name will be Love. Their first name will be Grace is here too, but it would be names that are adjectives that
Right.
are their quote unquote first names, and in the probably in the tradition that is handed down.
Yeah.
Cannot wait for your book to
Thank
to
you.
come out. Thank
Yeah, what you're saying is exactly, I totally agree. Part of the argument about names is that enslaved people transformed the meaning of names. So there's so many examples of this, right? Where that Spotswood is one, right? That man Spotswood, when he was given that name, most likely it meant it was named after an enslaver. It wasn't his choice, but naming his child that, it becomes a kin name. So similarly, when an enslaver forces somebody to be named queen, it's ironic and mocking. But when
you.
enslaved people name their children queen, it's a
Yeah, Mama Queen.
right, exactly.
Mhm.
Um, somebody asked what's impetus that drives and continues to drive me through these discoveries. So my original interest in studying African American history was sort of twofold. One is I've always been fascinated with history, but I had no interest in doing the sort of history that, to be frank, I don't feel is needed. We don't need more books on George Washington, for example. And to me, African American history is urgent and inherently political, and that's part of it. The other part is I am descended in part from enslavers, and so I've always felt that a responsibility to contribute to reckoning with the violence that was done, in part in my name, right? I mean, part of slavery was building generational wealth. I've since learned that I'm also descended from pretty radical abolitionists, including ancestor who, despite being in Tennessee, was very anti-slavery, dodged the Confederate draft, enlisted in the Union army, and survived the Civil War, only to be lynched when he got back home by other white people for fighting for the North. And that has sort of made me think more about this. And where I've sort of landed is that I think whiteness, regardless of who your ancestors are, whiteness is an inheritance that you can't really refuse. I can't not be white, right? But whiteness and the power of whiteness, the privileges, the all of it is essentially stolen property. And so, the phrase I always use is we teach children when they find something stolen or inherit something stolen to give it back, right? And so I think regardless of whether I'm descended from abolitionists or enslavers, and it turns out I'm descended from both, I am white. And so I think I have, like all white people, a choice of whether to just sort of pocket the world slavery built and the privileges of whiteness, or try to contribute to deconstructing white supremacy. Um, then obviously I would prefer to choose the latter. So
Wow. Wow, that is a very powerful statement. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
one last question that I do want to make sure that gets addressed. Someone earlier in the chat wanted to know how they can access your databases. So if we
oh,
can give
sure.
one last plug for
Mhm.
Kinfolkology.
Kinfolkology.org. And kinfolkology is just a word I made up, but it's kinfolk and then OLOGY.org. And then from there you click on at the top there's like a menu bar. Just click on data. And they're all listed there, or you can go to the overview page, which describes them all. Here, I'll just put that in the chat.
Okay. Thank you.
Should I briefly say about the Descendants Forum, or I guess you already kind of did?
No, but once you
Okay.
Yeah, please, you can talk about it.
So one thing I didn't have time to talk about because well, whatever, is so after building Oceans of Kinfolk, I think I mentioned this briefly, I ended up founding a nonprofit called Kinfolkology. So in addition to hosting the data that I've built over the years, Kinfolkology, the objectives are to support and collaborate descendant-led reckoning whenever we can. And so most recently, Kinfolkology, in partnership with the Clotilda Descendants Association, we've been building a new Congress of organizations led by descendants of enslaved ancestors. And those can be organizations that are like the CDA, like the Clotilda Descendants Association, entirely composed of descendants, or they can be organizations like Kinfolkology that have other folks like me involved, provided that descendants have equal or greater authority in the project or organization, and provided that the voting members of the Congress from that organization are descendants. And so right now, I think we have like 30 organizational members. It's less than a month old. And we are doing a collective launch on Monday. That'll include sharing more information about the Descendants Forum. And then 6 member organizations will be briefly sharing their work. And then I'll be moderating a panel with the New York Times opinion columnist, who's also a dear friend, so he didn't really have a choice, but Jamel Bowie, the journalist Soledad O'Brien, and the historian Thavolia Glimp.
Mhm.
And you can register for that to attend, requiring registration to try to prevent crazies, at descendantsforum.org.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Wynn. John, let me just add this before you conclude the meeting. 2 things. First of all, Anderson Fluke of the Catilda Association. I hope you know him. He's
Yep.
very, yeah, he's been very instrumental in bringing it to, we've collaborated on a few things. So he's a very fine gentleman there. I did want to point out that tonight at the Cambridge Public Library, the Cambridge Black History Project will be presenting a talk with our May speaker, Warren Eugene Milter Jr., in conversation with Susan Thomason. And that is the Cambridge Black History Project is a good alliance and friendship that we have. And, our good member, Paula Parrish, is very active in the Cambridge Black History Project. So if you're in that area, do stop by and join in the conversation. Um, Again, I would just like to thank you very much before Jordan concludes the meeting. I will say that just one thing you mentioned about the names and coming. Beverly and I just came back from Ghana. You mentioned Dr. Bellinger in your reference that you mentioned Ghana. We came back 2 weeks ago, and it was a very eye-opening because we went through and had the opportunity to tour what was then the forts that where enslaved people were brought in, and to take to travel some of the routes that enslaved people took when they were brought before they came to the Americas. So that was a very eye-opening experience. Uh, but again, I did want to just mention Dr. Williams. Thank you very much, and we I think we're going to have you back again if your time permits. This is a lot of questions seem to be still lingering about your work here, and by that time your book will be out. So maybe we can yeah.
Hope.
Jordan, oh, I'm sorry. You
I
said
was just
something.
saying, God willing, I hope so.
It will be, I'm
Well,
sure. Jordan.
yeah. Well, I mean, that concludes. I think that could have been a peaceful conclusion to what has been really a very powerful powerful discussion with Dr. Williams. We'd love to have you all again next Monday at the Descendants Forum inaugural event. I know that there's been a lot of hard work, and if you're interested in this work, obviously I know you are, it would be a great thing to join in on. Um, I guess with that, I conclude. We're so happy that you join us every month. We're happy to be aligned in this curiosity and uplifting these stories and preserving them, sharing them, disseminating them. I do want to remind you that we have all of our previous speakers on our YouTube page. So if you have a friend or someone who is like-minded that you'd like to share this information with, I want to challenge you to share this talk or a previous talk with somebody you know and love and you care for, whether it's posting it on your social media, sharing it with a friend, or even calling them over to your computer and watching it with you, because we want to make sure that this work is continuing to get out to the public. So with that, I say thank you from the Slave Legacy History Coalition. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Williams, for your fine, thought-provoking scholarship. I can think of many different parallels between what you said and the way that this country has developed up until this day. So thank you for your time, and with that I conclude
Bye-bye.
this month's speaking.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jordan.